So we're going to start today with the lecture number 1 for Latin American geography. That's the name of the lecture. This is for our geology, resources, and environment of Latin America. And since we're going to be talking about Latin America, we need to know the main places where we're going to be working and learning about. So I think it's convenient that we go over the main points. We're going to have a test after this. And the test is essentially a list of 50 different questions that you have to locate in a very simple map. So that is coming later, but in a preliminary way, we start with this first and then go over a map that we're going to provide you, and then a list of different places that should be familiar for your best learning through the course. So we go from here into a general overview of Latin America. And as you see here, we are all familiar with Mexico, seeing that Mexico is our neighbor in the south. But from Mexico all the way to the southern part of South America is obviously the same unit in the way we treat it in this class. So it's a long way. We talk about 10,700 kilometers all the way from Mexico to the south here in Tierra del Fuego, which is this island in the southern part. So as a generality, we see most of the languages are Latin. In fact, most of it is Spanish, and then we see Portuguese as a second important language. French is being spoken in French Guiana and Haiti. And in fact, the term Latin America was introduced by the French, trying to be a little more included into the political unit. So we're going to be going into some of the most important places in Latin America. In general, we may say all this is including a big part of the tropics. The tropical area, as you know, goes from the equatorial line, 0 latitude, all the way to the north, the Tropic of Cancer, which is right there in Mexico. And in the southern part, we go to the other tropic, the Tropic of Capricorn, which is not really so normally known. Both of them are actually situated to 23 degrees in 26 minutes, either north or south. And after that, obviously, we go into temperate regions here and temperate regions from the north of Mexico into Texas and such. Important for us, we're going to be talking about the main geographical components of the physical geography. You see, the trade winds are very important. Trade winds are either in the north here, coming from the northeast, or in the south, coming from the southeast. They are highly influenced by Coriolis effect and by the convection cell that happen to be in the equatorial line, moving up and down depending on the seasons. So this is an important component. We're going to talk about this a big deal in our class. Important because this area here, where we have most of the precipitation, all the winds coming into this direction are warm and humid. So when the cell goes into taking all that mass up into the colder regions of the atmosphere, precipitation happens. So all this area is a very high precipitation place. And then we have the westerlies as a consequence of the same thing, but in the temperate region. So we have the westerlies here in North America coming from southwest to the northeast. And in South America, it's the opposite. It's coming from the northwest to the southeast. So these winds are going to be defining much of the climate and precipitation. The second region we're going to be emphasizing here is Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica is better than Central America in a way because it's referring to the area that is including some of the remnants of the North America Cratonic area, and it's an historical region including many of the different old cultures in pre-Columbian cultures. You see Mayans and Aztecs and the central highland in Mexico. All those areas are better included to Mesoamerica than Central America. Central America starts from the Tehuantepec Isthmus here farther into the limit with South America. So, the largest countries in Latin America are in order, as we see here: Brazil, Mexico, and this is in order from extension. Brazil is the largest one with 8.5 million square kilometers, followed by Mexico. Well, not really. You see, there's not really an order here. Argentina should be the second one, 2.8. Mexico, number 3. And then followed by Peru, Colombia, and Venezuela. And then we have, obviously, Chile, which is happens to be a very interesting country since it goes all the way from the tropical region here all the way to the subarctic regions in the south, but very narrow, defined by the very conspicuous feature, which is the Andes Cordillera. Another important place are, in this geographical summary we're doing is rivers, and we start with the first one in South America, Orinoco River. It's not the most important one, but it's very important in the farther north part, including mostly Venezuela and Colombia. We see here it's one of the longest rivers, not the largest one, but it happened to be the fourth largest river in the world. And other very conspicuous feature, obviously, here is the Andes. The Andes goes from the north here, where we have the Andes in 3 different branches, going from Venezuela, Colombia with 2, and then finally unifying in one main range in here. Then we have the Altiplano in the central part of, including part of Peru and Bolivia, and even part of Peru, Chile and Argentina here, but just a tiny bit. And then again, forming a unit all the way south here, and they happen to be continuing underwater for some extent, and it got into the islands, Sandwich and Georgia, and then into the Antarctic Peninsula. So it's a very large range. Happened to be the highest mountain in the world after the Himalayan region is right here, and the Aconcagua is in between Chile and Argentina. Is so 6,961 meters, and it's a mountain produced by tectonic effect. It's not a volcano, as sometimes people think. They can define it in that way. The Altiplano defined here. It's a very interesting region. Happens to be a flat area, quite high. The altitude in average is 3,750 meters, so it's extremely high. And it happens to have, interestingly enough, big lakes in there. So we have the Titicaca Lake, which is an enormous lake. It's one of the largest in South America, and it's a freshwater lake, and it does drain into the Amazon River eventually. Some of these basins in here we see called salars. Salars are really playa lakes. They happen to be under heavy evaporation. So this heavy evaporation is produce a large amount of salt deposits, particularly because it's not really drained out of this. So all the water that goes in evaporates. That's the only way out. One of the largest deserts in the world, and happens to be one of the driest places in the world, is the Atacama Desert. This color area here is representing the main area where we have this particular geographic feature. It almost never rains in here. It's a constant state of desiccation. In particular, because the Andes are dropping all the humidity here, and nothing really reaches in there. But in fact, happens to be one of the richest places in minerals. Chile is profiting in a big way from the copper and zinc deposits in this area here. So we're going to talk about this a few times. The Titicaca Lake is a very interesting lake. As you see here, it's a beautiful picture. It's a freshwater lake, and it's quite deep. So, by volume of water and an area, is the largest lake in South America without any question. Another region loosely defined is the Pampas. You know, Pampas are coming from an Indian name, the Quichua language, meaning plain, obviously. And it happened to be including most of this central eastern part of Argentina, Uruguay, the whole country, Uruguay here, and the southern part of Brazil. Temperate climate, very much is a grass plain. Not very high. In general, the elevation of this is a few hundred meters at the most. Anyway. In Patagonia is another region that happens to ring a bell almost with everyone. This place is loosely defined by this river in here, which is the Negro River, or Rio Negro, and it's including 3 states in Argentina and part of Chile. Now it can be discussed that some of the Chilean area is not really the typical Patagonia because the precipitation happens to be much more concentrated in the Andes area here in the west part, other than the east part. This area is essentially dry, but in the Andes do have some abundance of glacial lakes. We're going to talk about that in particular because in this place in here there are some of the remnant continental glaciers other than Greenland. And Tierra del Fuego is also kind of a mythical place because it means essentially the land of fire. History is telling us that it happened to be named by Magellan sailing around and seeing fire on the coast. The fire was essentially a way of the native people living in there producing fires for their own activities. But this is an area, as you can see, strongly affected by glacier activity. So all these deep sea entrances are remnants of glacier activity. Latitude is 55 south, so you can imagine this is quite cold, and it's quite close to be affected into high latitude climates. So snow and ice is quite common in this place. Anyway. Now moving up into the central north part of South America here, we see the Paraná River. Paraná River is not just one river, it's a system. The Paraná is the one here that is going all the way into Brazil with the Paraguay River, connecting with other rivers. Uruguay is another one, and finally connecting into the Paraná River following into Brazil. So this is a very rich area, completely affected by rivers in a very large way. So in fact, this area here is called Mesopotamia, like the same place in Middle East, between Iran and Iraq, where we have our rivers dominating the geography. So, Pacific Ocean, obviously, a big important feature in the west, affecting all the borders and the rivers in the east. In fact, most of the rivers in Latin America are moving, especially in South America more than Central and Mesoamerica, are moving all the water to the east. There are few rivers going to the Pacific. Anyway. The Rio de la Plata, or River Plate basin, is essentially a collection of all the water coming from this basin, including the Paraguay, Paraná, and Uruguay River. All this line that we see with a different color is essentially going to that river. And in fact, it's looking like a bay, but it's all fresh water. So it's essentially affected by tides because it's in the Atlantic, but it's all fresh water all the way to this line over here. And the superlative river, as we like to call it, is the Amazon River. The Amazon River is the largest river in the world by volume, no question about it. But it's been disputed as the longest river in the world. If you remember your old geography, as I do remember mine, it used to be that the Nile River was allegedly being the longest. But Brazilian geographers and geologists are actually going all the way to this place in here and measuring all these tributary here as part of the Amazon River and go all the way to the mouth. It happens to be larger. So, you know, it's up to us if we take one or the other. Atlantic Ocean, obviously, a very important feature that is affecting all the countries, almost all the countries except Chile and Peru. But the Caribbean is greatly affected, and we see Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina are affected too. It's another important border for the Latin American region. The Greater Antilles, as we see here, Greater Antilles are formed by a larger island, which is Cuba, followed by Hispaniola, including two countries in there. We have Haiti, and then Dominican Republic, followed by Puerto Rico, and then we can put almost in the same standing point Jamaica. Jamaica, interestingly enough, may actually be out of Latin America, because the definition of Latin America, according to what the books are defining, is due by language. So Jamaica, officially, language is English. So, you know, from a cultural point of view, may actually be out of what we normally talk Latin America, or no, depending who is. Guyana too, obviously. So we see here the other islands, which are called the Lesser Antilles, by size, obviously, nothing to be pejorative in any way. But see, the Lesser Antilles are including many, many different islands with several different languages being spoken in different ones. We have places like Aruba, where it's actually a department of Holland, or of and then we have French islands, and we have British islands, and all that. It's a complex mix. This place is interesting. Also, the Caribbean is interesting because the hurricanes are really going through in a place we call Hurricane Alley, because we see here all these lines are representing one hurricane, and as we see, all of them are going more or less in the same line. This is due to the production of storms here due to the warming of the water, and big extension where warming water happens, and then winds are pushing the whole thing in this direction. This is due to Coriolis. Anything moving in the north hemisphere is veered to the right, and hurricanes do precisely that. So, interestingly enough, we don't really have many hurricanes in the south, because the extension here is less. There are a few, but not really as many. Important features in the very beginning, the south end of our border, and actually connected with the Rockies, we see the Sierra Madre. Sierra Madre are essentially two of them. The Sierra Madre Oriental, Eastern Sierra Madre if you want, and the Sierra Madre Occidental, which is Western Sierra Madre. The two of them are including in the center something like a plateau, what is called the Mexican highland over here. So very interesting geology in both of them. And then we have the Sierra of California, or California Range in here, which is another feature produced by an interaction with the Pacific plate and the North American plate in a very interesting way. So we're going to talk about that too later. Wow, all that nothing. Another feature that is quite conspicuous is Yucatan. Yucatan is prominence in the geography of Mexico, including almost closing up with Cuba here, not really closing up, but quite narrow. So Yucatan Peninsula is really a place that happens to be very interesting from the point of view of geology, since they used to be part of the north of Gulf of Mexico, and then in the history, through tectonic movement from the Jurassic on, moving to the south part of Mexico, and was accreted over here. So we're going to see about that. It's very interesting also from the cultural point of view, because all the Mayan civilization happens to be developing in that particular place. Gulf of Mexico, very important feature, is included into our own in Texas and Florida, but see, it's a dominant feature in the north part of Mexico. Obviously, Yucatan is having a very extensive shelf with an interesting connection into the geology of the Yucatan itself. Baja California is a long peninsula all the way from California into the far south central part of Mexico. It's extending about 775 miles from north to south. The sea over here receives the name of Cortez Sea, and it's a very interesting place. It's a very dry area too. The Gulf of California also, Sea of Cortez, both of the names can be used, and they are used. They call it Vermilion Sea or Bermejo in Spanish. It's a marginal sea, but it's quite rich in many aspects, in geological aspects as well as fish and resources of that nature. Going into the upper part of Venezuela, South America, we see Venezuela here is about 1.4 times the size of Texas, dominated by the branch of the Andes ending right there, the Caribbean, and the internal rivers that are communicating with the Amazon eventually and going to the sea, and the Orinoco River too, obviously. So interestingly enough, we have here the massive in the central part. Those are places very interesting where we see remnants of Precambrian rocks, very interesting in many ways, because they are actually quite high compared with the llanos in here. This area here is quite low. This area are flat but high in elevation. You see, it's a particular name they use for that. It's called the Tipuis. We're going to talk about that later. Followed by Colombia to the west. Colombia is about 1.6 times the size of Texas. We compare always the size without something is familiar to us. Right? Capital Bogota, 50 million Colombians, and it's a very interesting country because it does actually divide the geography by the branches of the Andes and the rivers that run in between those branches. So Ecuador to the south. Ecuador is a small country, happens to be dominated by the Andes, as we see here, and then it's a low area in the coastal region. happen to be right there in the equatorial line, obviously. What else, right? You got very nice, beautiful mountains in the Andes. Many of them are volcanoes. Beautiful place. Peru in the south happen to be large. It's about, yeah, it shouldn't be like this, 185%. Well, it's almost twice the size of Texas. A very interesting place. We're going to talk about Peru and Bolivia when we go into the cultures of the Incas, and in particular, Ecuador is also part of the Inca Empire, but the Andes are the dominant feature in Peru, as it was in Ecuador too, but the Andes define Peru essentially. In the coastal area, the Andes are quite close to the coast, and as we go into the west part of, the east part of Peru, we start to see an influence of the Amazon environment. So in Peru, if you go from the coast up into the mountains quickly enough, halfway you go into the Amazon environment. So they do have the two environments, Amazon jungle environment and high mountains in the central eastern part. Machu Picchu is in the boundary of the mountains going into the jungle in a few kilometers to the east. All right. We see here something else, and this is obviously a physiographic feature we call the Humboldt current. I prefer to use the name Humboldt. Humboldt was a German scientist that did work extensively in South America, and sometimes it's referred as the Peru current. And it goes this way. It comes from the south, and it goes into the north, bringing cold water from the south into the north. And since the water is cold, it's also inducing upwelling from lower levels with a high input of nutrients. So fishing in this area is one of the best in the world. And because of that, being cold essentially making this area quite dry. It's actually analogous to what happened with the California current. California current is also coming from the north, cold, and going into the central area. Keeping going south, we see Bolivia now. Bolivia is boundary with Peru, in a border with Peru, Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, and Chile. And it happens to be an interesting country because it's landlocked. You got no connection to the ocean. Now, it was a war between Chile against Bolivia and Peru, and they lose the connection to the sea, and also all the access to the wealth of minerals in this area here. So Bolivians are not really very happy about the southern neighbors in the Pacific side. Still, the Bolivian Navy works only in the Titicaca Lake, nothing else. Right? It's about 1.6 times the size of Texas, 11 million people, and it's a very interesting country too. So we're going to talk about Bolivia too in many different ways. Chile, about the size of Texas, but you know, obviously, in a very long string of land from the north in the limit with Peru and Bolivia, all the way in the south, where they actually close to the Atlantic in this area here. So they go from subtropical desertic climates into temperate climates in here. It's actually a Mediterranean climate. We normally define Mediterranean climate as places where we humans like to live because the temperature and the conditions are very nice. But they go further south into cold, high latitude climates close to the south, in what we normally may call the Patagonia region. Argentina is the equivalent to Chile, but in the east side of the Andes. So the Andes is actually working as a boundary between the two countries. So it's about 4 times the size of Texas, 45, 50 million people according to the last census. And it happens to include several regions, you know, the Pampas, as we mentioned, Patagonia, and the central part in here, which is kind of a mountainous, and the Andes, obviously. Uruguay is an essential country in the Pampas. It's about 25%. No, this is not right. It's about a quarter of the size of Texas, in a better way. Only 3.4 million people. It's a rather small country, very similar to the way that happens in the Pampas in here and in Brazil. So there are interesting connections in there. Paraguay is the second landlocked country. The only difference is actually Paraguay got a way to get out through the river, the Paraná River, and going into the Atlantic in this way. But still, it's about half of the size of Texas. Landlocked. Do have a desertic area here in the Chaco. It's a very dry place, and they have also a very humid jungle environment into the east. So only 7 million people. Brazil, the largest country in South America and in Latin America, obviously. 12 times the size of Texas. It does include 50% of South America, as you see there, 200 and some million people. Dominant feature, the Amazon River. You see here, the Amazon River is essentially half of the country, even more. This country, they do speak Portuguese. Happens to be an easy Portuguese for Spanish speakers, so it's not too different. Now going up, completing the circuit, in here we see French Guiana. It's a small country, only 84,000 square kilometers, 12% of the size of Texas, not even a million, not even a half a million of people, and they do speak French. It's a humid place in general. So Guyana per se, this is the Guyana that happen to speak in English. So it's a little larger than the other, and it happens to be in the Atlantic side here. Not even a million people. And Suriname, which is in between the two, is English speaking also. The reason why it's not one country, one with the other, is because these places were very sparsely populated and not really many people living there. Not even 500,000 lives in here. So English speaking too. So, you know, all in all, these two, Guyana and Suriname, maybe out of what we define as Latin America because of the language. But anyway, well, Mexico obviously is very large in population, about 3 times, close to 3 times the size of Texas. 126 million people living in there, and so it's a very, very populated country. Belize is also an interesting country. Happens to be right here. Right here, actually. It's much easier to see it in here because the arrow is pointing to a tiny place that happens to be also official language is in English. They happen to speak in a Creole mix, but it's not really very large. 3% the size of Texas. The main reason we're going to talk about this country is because they have a beautiful coral reef. It's an incredible environment where the coral reefs are one of the best in the Atlantic side. And Guatemala is in a border with Belize, as we see here, and we see it's in a border with Mexico all around here, and in the south is bordered with Honduras. So Guatemala essentially is comprising by the Caribbean coast, just a tiny bit in here, the central part of the Yucatan place, the Yucatan Peninsula, the volcanic range, and the Pacific coast. 16% of the size of Texas. The neighbor to the south, Honduras, is 16% the size of Texas, close to 10 million people living there. So much more populated than the previous ones. We're going to talk about this one because they do have an interesting potential as resources for geothermal energy. We talk about geothermal energy in one chapter. And we go further south, Salvador. Salvador is also very highly populated, 6.8 million people in a smaller size. So Salvador is bordered by Guatemala in the north, Honduras in the north too, and is essentially all Pacific. And then Nicaragua. Nicaragua borders with Honduras and Costa Rica in the south. Nicaragua is also very interesting place. You got a very interesting volcanic expression here, and those volcanoes are close to water. Those two things are interesting from the geothermal point of view, and we're going to talk about this also when the chapter about geothermal energy, alternative energies, comes over. This is a country that do have a connection with the Pacific and the Atlantic. It's about 20% of the size of Texas, 6.5 million people. Yeah. So, and finally, to the south, Costa Rica. Costa Rica is also a country that is border with the Pacific in the west and the Atlantic or Caribbean Sea to the east. So in fact, a few times been projects, just projects to make a connection between the Pacific and the Caribbean Sea through Costa Rica, but it happened to be too difficult, really. 7% the size of Texas, 5 million people. It's a very interesting country too. And Panama, to complete the whole thing, Panama is the isthmus itself, if we can define a place where it's narrower between the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, and this is the place where we have the Panama Canal. It happened to be something we did a long time ago, more than 100 years, obviously, and the connection goes through here, and using an artificial lake. That lake is essentially a place where the ships going up through a series of devices and then go down into the Caribbean Sea later. So it's not really a marine connection. It's an artificial connection. Here is a detail of the Panama Canal. 4.3 million people. It's about 11% what Texas is. Cuba, a very massive island in the Caribbean, is all continental crust. Used to have a volcanic activity, no longer. Is limited by the Caribbean Sea in the south, the Gulf of Mexico in the northwest, and then the Atlantic in the far northeast here. 16% in size of Texas, 11 million people lives in there. Jamaica, right to the south of Cuba, is also continental crust, 1.5% the size of Texas. Puerto Rico is U.S. territory. They have a governor, part of the United States in a particular way. 1.3% the size of Texas, 3.3 million people. It's an island, obviously, including all the other islands here. Vieques and Culebra, those islands are also part of Puerto Rico itself. Hispaniola is much larger than Puerto Rico, and it's actually quite close to Cuba. And so we go from Cuba all the way to Puerto Rico in a decreased extension of land. So Hispaniola is only 1% of the size of Texas. Not sure this is right. See? No, this is not right. So if Puerto Rico is 1.3% and Hispaniola is 1%, obviously that doesn't really make sense. Hispaniola is very small compared with Hispaniola. I'm sorry, Puerto Rico is very small compared with Hispaniola. We will fix it. It does include two countries, interestingly enough: Haiti in the west part, and Dominican Republic in the east. In the east, so west Haiti, east Dominican Republic. In this Dominican Republic, the official language is Spanish. In the west Haiti, the official language is French, and that's all we have. So eventually, we're going to produce the geography map with all the names on it, and then we're going to give you an empty map and a list of names where you can play and find out where those places are. All right, that's it. Thank you very much.